A routine flight should have ended with a landing, a report, and a place in aviation records. Instead, one account described something far stranger: a passenger aircraft making contact with air traffic control after it was believed to belong to another time. The message reportedly came from a plane that should not have been there, creating a mystery that has fascinated aviation enthusiasts for decades. Hidden behind the story is a question that continues to draw attention. How could a flight appear to cross a gap that should never have existed? You will examine the strange path of this aviation mystery, from the alleged radio communication and the aircraft at the centre of the story, to the records, technology, and investigations that attempt to separate fact from folklore. The search leads through the world of aviation, where every flight leaves traces behind, yet some stories continue because of the questions they leave unanswered. The plane that arrived from another decade. Long before aircraft could be tracked continuously by satellites and digital surveillance, much of commercial aviation unfolded beyond the immediate reach of those on the ground. Once an airliner disappeared over the horizon, controllers and airline operators depended on scheduled radio reports, navigational checkpoints, and the steady rhythm of communication to know where it was. Between those moments of contact stretched vast distances of ocean, mountains, and cloud, where a flight could become little more than a moving position on a map and a voice carried through static. It was an era in which silence was not always unusual, yet it could still leave room for questions that lingered far longer than any journey was ever meant to last. Throughout aviation history, there have been genuine disappearances that remain unsolved despite decades of investigation. Aircraft have vanished without distress calls, final positions have remained uncertain, and wreckage has sometimes taken years to locate, or has never been found at all. These unresolved cases have become reminders that despite remarkable advances in technology, flight has never been entirely free from mystery. Every unexplained disappearance invites speculation, and wherever evidence ends, stories often begin. Among those stories, one has proven remarkably difficult to erase. It does not begin with an explosion, a storm, or an emergency transmission. Instead, it starts with something far quieter, a routine radio exchange that supposedly should have been impossible. According to the tale, an ordinary commercial airliner established contact with air traffic control after being absent for decades, leaving controllers to confront an aircraft that seemed to belong to another era entirely. The idea is so extraordinary that it has circulated for years through books, magazines, television programs, websites, and countless retellings, each repeating the same astonishing conclusion: that a passenger flight had somehow crossed not merely distance, but time itself. At the centre of the legend is a name that has become familiar to anyone interested in aviation mysteries: Avianca Flight 914. In its most common form, the story claims that the aircraft departed from New York on a scheduled flight bound for Miami during the mid-1950s, before disappearing without explanation. Decades later, according to the account, the same airplane unexpectedly contacted air traffic control, asking for landing instructions as though nothing unusual had happened. The controllers who answered reportedly discovered that the date given by the crew belonged to another generation, while the world outside the cockpit had moved forward by many years. It is an extraordinary narrative because it unfolds through details that sound surprisingly ordinary. The pilots are described as calm. The radio communication follows familiar aviation procedures. There is no dramatic announcement that time has somehow shifted, nor any immediate realization aboard the aircraft that history has changed. Instead, the impossible is said to reveal itself gradually through routine questions and equally routine answers, transforming an everyday exchange between pilot and controller into one of the most discussed stories in paranormal aviation. For many listeners, that sense of normality is precisely what makes the legend so compelling. Aviation depends upon systems designed to eliminate uncertainty. Every scheduled flight receives a designated call sign, follows an approved route, communicates using standardized phraseology, and leaves behind records that can later be examined. Because commercial flying is so carefully documented, the suggestion that an aircraft could simply disappear from one decade and appear in another seems to challenge not only physics, but the entire framework upon which modern aviation operates. Yet the more closely the story is examined, the more unusual another aspect becomes. Unlike genuine aviation accidents that have generated thousands of pages of investigative reports, official correspondence, witness statements, maintenance records, and government findings. The account of Flight 914 appears strangely detached from the documentary trail that normally accompanies significant events. Despite its popularity, references to the incident consistently lead back to retellings rather than contemporary evidence. Each version repeats familiar scenes, but identifying where those scenes first appeared proves unexpectedly difficult. This absence has done little to diminish the legend. If anything, it has helped sustain it. Stories lacking clear origins often adapt as they pass from one generation to the next, accumulating new details while shedding others. Over time, small differences emerge between versions. Some accounts alter the year in which the aircraft supposedly departed. Others change the airport where it allegedly landed, or describe different conversations between the cockpit and the control tower. Even the airline itself is occasionally replaced in later retellings, yet the central idea remains remarkably consistent. An ordinary passenger flight somehow returned from a past that should have been unreachable. The legend gained even greater momentum with the rise of television documentaries, paranormal magazines, and later the internet, where dramatic stories could be shared without the burden of citations or archival evidence. As websites copied one another and videos repeated the same narrative, the distinction between a documented event and an often repeated claim became increasingly difficult for casual readers to recognize. Familiarity gradually became mistaken for authenticity. A story encountered often enough could begin to feel historical simply because it had been told so many times. That transformation is hardly unique to Flight 914. Aviation has long occupied a unique place within modern folklore because it combines advanced technology with environments that remain fundamentally isolated. A cockpit suspended miles above the Earth offers few witnesses beyond those inside it, while radio transmissions can carry voices across enormous distances with no visual confirmation of what lies at the other end. When communication falters or records appear incomplete, imagination readily fills the empty spaces left behind. None of this proves that the legend is true, nor does it automatically dismiss it. The enduring popularity of Flight 914 says less about whether a plane truly crossed decades than it does about humanity's fascination with mysteries that seem almost believable. The story borrows the language of ordinary aviation so convincingly that it invites listeners to wonder whether such an impossible event might have slipped unnoticed into history, hidden somewhere among the countless flights that crossed the skies during the 20th century. Before asking whether such a flight could ever have happened, there is a more fundamental question that has to be answered first. Where did the story actually come from? Reconstructing the original story. Before any mystery can be investigated, its story must first be assembled exactly as it has been told. Legends often survive not because every version agrees with the last, but because they preserve the same remarkable idea, even as individual details shift over time. That is especially true of the account surrounding Avianca Flight 914, which has been repeated so frequently that many people remember its conclusion, while rarely stopping to ask whether every retelling describes the same sequence of events. Before searching archives, examining airline records, or weighing scientific explanations, it is necessary to understand precisely what the legend claims happened from beginning to end. Curiously, that task proves far less straightforward than the legend itself would suggest. Unlike a documented aviation accident, whose official reports establish a fixed chronology, Flight 914 exists almost entirely through secondary retellings that have accumulated over decades. Articles, television features, books on unexplained phenomena, and countless internet posts often describe the same extraordinary event, yet subtle differences appear almost immediately when those accounts are compared. The broad outline remains familiar, but smaller details have a tendency to drift. Some versions introduce additional dialogue, others shorten key moments, and still others alter locations or dates while insisting they are recounting the same incident. Rather than finding a single original account, anyone attempting to reconstruct the story quickly discovers a collection of narratives that overlap without matching perfectly. Most retellings begin with an ordinary commercial flight departing from New York, presenting the journey as routine until it abruptly slips beyond explanation. The aircraft is almost always described as a Douglas DC-4, a 4-engine propeller-driven airliner that genuinely served airlines around the world after the Second World War. That choice is significant because the DC-4 was a familiar sight during the late 1940s and 1950s, making it an aircraft that listeners can easily imagine operating on domestic passenger routes. According to the legend, the flight leaves for Miami under normal conditions, carrying passengers who expect nothing more unusual than a few hours in the air. No emergency is reported before departure, no mechanical problem is mentioned, and no warning suggests that the journey will become anything other than another entry in an airline timetable. It is this deliberate sense of normality that gives the story its momentum. The extraordinary does not arrive immediately. It emerges from what initially appears to be an entirely unremarkable flight. According to the version repeated most widely, the aircraft remained absent for decades before unexpectedly making radio contact with an airport that should have belonged to a different era. The story claims that the pilot requested routine landing instructions, believing the date and circumstances of the flight were exactly as they had been at departure. Meanwhile, those listening from the ground allegedly discovered that many years had passed since the airplane was supposed to have vanished. The legend often describes an exchange in which controllers struggle to understand what they are hearing, while the crew remains equally unaware that anything is wrong. This contrast lies at the heart of the narrative. Neither side is portrayed as frightened at first. Instead, both continue communicating through the calm, standardized language expected in aviation, allowing the impossible realization to emerge gradually rather than through dramatic revelation. What follows in nearly every account is a conversation that has become the defining moment of the entire legend. The exact wording differs from one source to another, but the structure rarely changes. The pilot identifies the flight and requests permission to land. Air traffic control responds with questions intended to verify the aircraft's identity. As the exchange continues, the supposed discrepancy between the crew's understanding of the date and the date known by those on the ground becomes impossible to ignore. Some retellings claim the crew reacted with confusion. Others describe disbelief inside the control tower instead. In several versions, once the aircraft's occupants supposedly realized what had happened, they refused further assistance and departed before anyone could intervene. That abrupt ending has become one of the story's most memorable features because it leaves behind no opportunity for investigators to question the crew, examine the aircraft, or verify the passengers' identities. The mystery survives largely because the legend removes the very evidence that might otherwise resolve it. Despite the consistency of its central premise, important details begin to shift when different versions are placed side by side. The year in which the flight supposedly departed is not always identical. The date of its alleged return also varies between sources. Some accounts identify the destination as Miami before describing an unexpected landing elsewhere, while others place the final approach at a different airport entirely. Even the conversations attributed to the pilots and controllers are far from uniform. Certain retellings include lengthy exchanges, whereas others reduce the encounter to only a few dramatic lines. Occasionally, the airline itself changes, producing alternative versions that closely resemble the Flight 914 story, while assigning it to another carrier. These differences may appear minor in isolation, but together they suggest that the legend has evolved through repeated retelling rather than remaining anchored to a single, stable source. Equally revealing is the way the story borrows authentic elements of commercial aviation to strengthen its credibility. The aircraft type is real. The airline existed. The route between New York and Miami was well established during the era in which the legend is usually set. Radio communication between pilots and controllers follows standardized procedures, and routine requests for landing clearance are among the most ordinary exchanges heard in aviation. By surrounding an extraordinary claim with recognizable details, the narrative creates an impression of authenticity that can be surprisingly persuasive. Readers who recognize the aircraft or the airline may unconsciously accept the surrounding story more readily, even though the presence of genuine historical elements does not, by itself, verify the extraordinary events attached to them. Taken together, these recurring claims create a narrative that feels remarkably complete, even though its foundations remain surprisingly difficult to verify. The legend provides an identifiable aircraft, a recognizable airline, an established route, and a sequence of events that unfolds with enough detail to resemble a historical account. Yet it stops just short of offering the kinds of specifics that investigators rely upon most. Passenger names are generally absent. Contemporary newspaper reports are rarely cited. flight documentation, maintenance records, and official correspondence are almost never presented alongside the story. Instead, the legend depends upon repetition itself, gaining authority from the number of times it has been retold, rather than from evidence that can be independently examined. It is this unusual balance, rich in narrative detail yet sparse in documentary support, that has allowed the account to persist while remaining remarkably resistant to verification. Rather than settling the question, reconstructing the legend only makes one problem increasingly difficult to ignore. If the story has changed as it passed from one source to another, then identifying its earliest form becomes just as important as evaluating its most popular version. Every inconsistency raises another question about what was added, what was omitted, and whether the tale originated from a misunderstood report, a work of fiction, or something else entirely. The closer the narrative is examined, the less it resembles a single historical event, and the more it begins to resemble a puzzle assembled from pieces that do not always belong to the same picture. If a commercial flight matching this description ever truly existed, the historical record should still know where to find it, searching for the missing flight. Unlike stories passed from one person to another, commercial aviation leaves behind records that are expected to endure for decades. Every scheduled journey, whether remembered or forgotten by the public, becomes part of a system built on documentation, regulation, and accountability. Aircraft may eventually be retired, airlines may change names, and airports may be rebuilt. But the paper trail created by commercial operations often survives long after the flights themselves have faded from memory. If the legend of Flight 914 has any historical foundation, then somewhere beyond the repeated retellings, there should be evidence that exists independently of the story itself. The investigation therefore shifts away from folklore and toward the quiet persistence of archived records, where even an ordinary passenger flight can leave traces that outlast generations. Every scheduled passenger flight begins generating paperwork long before its engines are ever started. Airlines assign flight numbers to organize their networks, publish timetables for passengers, file operational information with aviation authorities, and maintain records covering aircraft assignments, maintenance, and crew scheduling. Airports document arrivals and departures, while civil aviation agencies oversee registration systems designed to distinguish one aircraft from another. Newspapers once printed airline schedules, travel guides listed regular routes, and industry publications reported fleet expansions and route changes with remarkable detail. Although no single archive contains every piece of information ever created, commercial aviation has long depended upon documentation that can often be reconstructed by comparing multiple historical sources. For an event as extraordinary as an aircraft disappearing and supposedly returning decades later, investigators would reasonably expect far more than a story passed from one publication to the next. Armed with the outline preserved by the legend, the next step is to determine whether Flight 914 ever appeared in the historical record at all. The challenge begins with the flight number itself. Flight numbers are not random labels attached permanently to a single aircraft. Airlines assign them to specific services, and over time they may be changed, reused, or retired as routes evolve. That means the existence of a flight designated 914 would not by itself prove or disprove the legend. What matters is whether historical evidence connects that number to the route, airline, and circumstances described in the story. Yet this is where the investigation begins to encounter uncertainty. Despite the popularity of the legend, publicly available historical sources have never produced a contemporaneous record confirming the disappearance of an Avianca passenger flight matching the narrative most commonly repeated today. Attention naturally turns to the aircraft itself, because every commercial airliner carries an identity that extends far beyond its flight number. Aircraft are distinguished by construction numbers assigned by their manufacturers and by civil registrations issued by national aviation authorities. These identifiers remain associated with the airframe throughout its operational life, regardless of how many different routes it flies or how often its assigned flight number changes. The Douglas DC-4, frequently identified in the legend, is a well-documented aircraft type whose production history and worldwide operators have been studied extensively by aviation historians. Many surviving examples have traceable ownership records stretching back decades. If one particular DC-4 had genuinely disappeared during scheduled commercial service under the circumstances described in the legend, investigators would expect that aircraft's identity to appear somewhere within registration records, fleet histories, accident databases, or historical publications devoted to civil aviation. Yet the legend itself never identifies a registration, construction number, or individual airframe that can be independently verified, leaving researchers with an aircraft type but no confirmed aircraft. Beyond the airplane, the airline's own operations offer another path through the past. Avianca is one of the world's oldest continuously operating airlines, with a history extending back to the early years of commercial aviation in Latin America. Like other major carriers, its development has been documented through annual reports, fleet changes, route announcements, advertising material, and industry coverage. Historians examining the airline's past can trace how its network expanded, which aircraft entered service, and how international operations evolved over time. These records do not merely preserve milestones, they also reflect the practical realities of airline operations. Introducing a new route, changing equipment, or suspending service often generated documentation because such decisions affected passengers, airports, regulators, and the company's own planning. Against that backdrop, the disappearance of a scheduled international passenger flight would represent an event of enormous significance. It would be expected to leave behind far more than a story told years later. Historical publications provide a different kind of evidence, one created not for investigators, but for travellers, journalists, and the aviation industry itself. Long before digital databases, printed timetables helped passengers plan journeys months in advance, while newspapers regularly reported major aviation incidents that captured public attention. Trade magazines monitored airline operations, aircraft deliveries, and changes within the rapidly growing commercial aviation sector. Although no historical archive is perfectly complete, these independent publications often preserve details that official records alone cannot provide. Researchers searching for Flight 914 have therefore looked not only at airline material, but also at broader historical sources capable of confirming whether such a disappearance attracted contemporary notice. Despite the legend's dramatic claims, no widely recognised newspaper coverage or verified reporting from the period has surfaced describing a commercial passenger aircraft vanishing under the circumstances later attributed to Flight 914. For an event that would almost certainly have drawn international attention, that absence becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Instead of uncovering a forgotten trail, the search repeatedly arrives at the same unexpected destination: silence. There is no verified accident investigation corresponding to the legend. No authenticated passenger manifest has emerged. No maintenance documentation identifies an aircraft that fits the narrative. No official aviation authority has acknowledged an event resembling the one described in popular retellings. Silence, however, can be misleading. Archives are never perfect, and historians understand that records are occasionally lost, damaged, or incomplete. Yet the disappearance of isolated documents is very different from the absence of every major category of evidence that would normally accompany a scheduled commercial flight. The more the investigation expands across independent sources, the more striking it becomes that the legend appears to exist primarily within later retellings, rather than within records created at the time the event supposedly occurred. At that point, the investigation reaches an important turning point, because the absence of documentary evidence does not explain why the legend chose a particular place for its most extraordinary claim. Nearly every version anchors the story to a specific airport, presenting it as the stage upon which the impossible briefly entered the ordinary world before disappearing again. Whether the flight itself can be verified remains uncertain, but the location identified in the legend is entirely real, with its own history, procedures, and surviving records. If the paperwork offers no confirmation, perhaps the setting itself can reveal whether the story could ever have unfolded in the way generations of retellings have claimed. If the archives could not confirm the flight, the location where it was supposedly seen would become the next place to test the legend against history. The airport that was said to have witnessed it. Some locations become part of history because of what can be proven, while others are remembered because of what is said to have happened there. Once the search through airline records and historical documentation reaches its limits, attention naturally shifts to the place where the legend claims the impossible briefly became reality. Unlike a story that changes with each retelling, an airport is a tangible environment governed by procedures, infrastructure, and thousands of ordinary arrivals and departures. If the tale of Flight 914 unfolded anywhere at all, it would have done so within a setting that was designed to observe aircraft, communicate with crews, and record unusual events. That makes the location itself more than a backdrop to the story. It becomes another witness whose history can be examined. Far from existing only as the backdrop to a legend, the airport identified in most versions has a well-documented history of its own. The accounts most frequently place the alleged landing at what is now known as Miami International Airport, one of the busiest aviation hubs in the United States, and an airport whose importance stretches back to the rapid expansion of commercial air travel during the 20th century. Long before modern satellite navigation transformed aviation, airports like Miami already served as critical gateways linking North America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Airlines from across the region operated scheduled passenger services through its runways, making the airport a familiar destination for international crews. In that respect, the legend chose a setting that feels entirely plausible. A commercial airliner arriving there would never have seemed unusual on its own. The mystery begins only when the story asks listeners to believe that one particular arrival belonged to a different decade. Imagine an ordinary arrival unfolding on a routine day, when every movement from the sky to the terminal follows a sequence refined through decades of aviation practice. As an aircraft approaches controlled airspace, communication with air traffic control establishes the foundation for everything that follows. Controllers identify the flight, issue instructions based on traffic and weather, assign a runway, and monitor the aircraft's progress until it lands. After touchdown, responsibility often shifts again as taxi instructions guide the aircraft safely toward its assigned parking position. None of these exchanges exists in isolation. Arrivals involve coordination between controllers, ground personnel, airline staff, emergency services prepared to respond if necessary, and numerous other individuals whose responsibilities intersect throughout the process. Even before digital surveillance became standard, the arrival of a scheduled passenger aircraft was rarely an event observed by only one person. Against that reality, the legend asks the airport to play a role unlike anything found in normal commercial operations. According to the story, an aircraft whose disappearance supposedly belonged to the past entered controlled airspace, established radio contact, received instructions, landed, and briefly occupied the airport before departing once again. If such an event had truly occurred, it would have unfolded in one of the most structured environments in civil aviation. Every arriving aircraft must fit into the movement of surrounding traffic. Controllers balance departures and arrivals, maintain separation between aircraft, and constantly update one another as conditions change. A flight that appeared unexpectedly without corresponding operational information would almost immediately become the subject of heightened attention. The legend depends upon that very contrast. An impossible aircraft entering a system designed to identify everything that flies within it. Inside the control tower, unusual events are rarely witnessed by only a single individual. Air traffic control operates through coordination rather than isolation, with controllers communicating not only with pilots, but also with fellow controllers responsible for adjacent sectors, ground movement, and other aspects of airport operations. Supervisors may become involved whenever unexpected situations develop, while communication with airlines and emergency services can begin within moments if circumstances require it. Although procedures have evolved over time, the central principle has remained consistent. Significant anomalies are shared, evaluated, and managed collectively. That collaborative structure makes the legend especially intriguing because it implies that numerous aviation professionals would have encountered an event unlike any they had experienced before. If a commercial airliner had truly identified itself as belonging to another era, the conversation would almost certainly have extended beyond a single voice speaking into a radio headset. Equally important are the records created after an unexpected occurrence, because airports are designed to document events that fall outside routine operations. Operational logs help reconstruct airport activity, while incident reporting procedures exist precisely because unusual situations may later require investigation. The specific records preserved vary according to the period, the airport, and the nature of the event itself. but commercial aviation has long recognised the importance of documenting irregular operations. An unidentified aircraft, an emergency declaration, or a serious communication problem would not simply disappear once the engine stopped. Such events often generate reports intended to explain what occurred, how personnel responded, and whether future procedures should be adjusted. Yet despite the dramatic nature of the Flight 914 legend, no verified airport documentation has ever emerged, confirming that controllers or airport officials recorded an arrival resembling the one described in later retellings. Once again, the investigation encounters not contradictory evidence, but the absence of evidence where one would reasonably expect it to exist. Yet even after comparing the procedure with the story, one question continues to overshadow every other. The physical setting does not completely dismiss the legend, but neither does it support it. Miami International Airport is undeniably real, its operations extensively documented, and its role in international aviation well established. The procedures governing arriving aircraft are equally real, developed through decades of experience intended to make commercial flight as safe and predictable as possible. Against that carefully organised environment, the legend introduces an event that seems to depend upon ordinary aviation functioning exactly as expected, until the moment it collides with something extraordinary. The airport itself offers no indication that such a collision ever took place, leaving the investigation suspended between a compelling narrative and a historical landscape that remains remarkably quiet. Whether the legend could survive now depended on a single conversation that would have had to pass between the cockpit and the control tower. Could air traffic control mistake the year? Between an aircraft and the ground lies nothing more tangible than a voice carried across the radio. Every arrival, departure, and change of course begins with spoken words exchanged between people who may never see one another, relying instead on procedures refined through decades of experience. Long before radar screens became increasingly sophisticated and satellite surveillance transformed aviation, those voices formed the essential link between pilots navigating through the sky and controllers responsible for keeping aircraft safely separated below. If the legend of Flight 914 depends upon a single moment above all others, it is not the alleged landing itself, but the conversation that supposedly made everyone realize something was terribly wrong. Unlike ordinary conversation, aviation communication follows a carefully standardized language designed to leave as little room for misunderstanding as possible. Commercial pilots and air traffic controllers do not improvise their terminology or rely on casual expressions when clarity matters. Standard phraseology, promoted internationally through procedures developed under the framework of the International Civil Aviation Organization, exists because a misunderstood instruction can have immediate consequences for flight safety. Altitudes, headings, runway assignments, and clearances are delivered using established formats intended to communicate precise information as efficiently as possible. Although local variations exist and procedures have evolved over time, the underlying objective has remained consistent. Every transmission should reduce uncertainty rather than create it. Against that backdrop, the remarkable dialogue described in the Flight 914 legend becomes more than dramatic storytelling. It becomes a conversation that must somehow fit within one of aviation's most disciplined systems of communication. Before a controller can issue a single instruction, the aircraft's identity must first be established through multiple layers of verification. Historically, controllers relied on flight progress strips, filed flight plans, scheduled routes, position reports, and radio communication to maintain an organized picture of aircraft moving through controlled airspace. Modern technology has introduced transponders, satellite navigation, and digital surveillance. But the fundamental principle remains the same. Controllers need to know who they are talking to before they can safely direct an aircraft. A flight number alone does not exist in isolation. It is expected to correspond with a planned journey, an airline, an approximate location, and operational information already available to those managing the surrounding airspace. Even during earlier decades, when technology was less advanced than it is today, identifying aircraft involved far more than simply accepting the first call sign heard over the radio. Measured against those procedures, the central exchange described in the Flight 914 legend becomes increasingly difficult to reconcile with normal operations. Most versions suggest that the pilot identified the aircraft using a routine call sign, before requesting landing instructions, implying that the initial moments of communication sounded entirely ordinary. Yet commercial aviation is built around continuous awareness of expected traffic. Controllers anticipate scheduled arrivals, coordinate with neighbouring sectors, and organise aircraft according to flight plans already in their possession. An unexpected transmission would not necessarily be dismissed, but neither would it exist in a procedural vacuum. Questions concerning the aircraft's identity, position, intentions, and route would naturally follow before routine landing instructions could simply continue. The legend compresses those complexities into a brief dramatic exchange, whereas real-world air traffic control depends upon gathering enough information to remove uncertainty before making operational decisions. Perhaps the most remarkable claim involves not the aircraft itself, but the moment when two different understandings of time supposedly met on the same frequency. This is the scene that has given Flight 914 its enduring reputation, yet it also presents one of the greatest technical challenges to the story. In normal aviation communication, there is rarely any practical reason for a controller and a pilot to discuss the calendar year during routine operations. Flight plans contain dates and times relevant to scheduling, while radio transmissions focus on immediate operational needs such as navigation, weather, sequencing, and safety. Pilots routinely report positions, estimated arrival times, and other flight information, but under ordinary circumstances they are not asked to confirm what year they believe it is. That does not make such a conversation impossible in every conceivable situation, but it does mean the dramatic turning point described in the legend would require circumstances far removed from standard communication practices. The story depends not only upon an extraordinary event, but also upon a highly unusual direction for an otherwise routine exchange. Had such an exchange genuinely taken place, it would almost certainly have triggered responses extending well beyond the controller who first answered the call. Air traffic control functions through coordination, particularly when an aircraft presents unexpected circumstances or raises questions affecting operational safety. Supervisors can become involved, neighbouring control facilities may be notified, and communication with the airline itself would likely follow if serious inconsistencies emerged. Depending upon the nature of the situation, additional government or aviation authorities could also be informed. None of these responses assumes anything supernatural. They simply reflect the way aviation manages uncertainty. Commercial flight is built upon layers of verification precisely because unusual events occasionally occur, whether caused by equipment problems, navigational confusion, communication difficulties, or emergencies requiring immediate attention. A crew apparently identifying itself from another era would represent a situation unlike any described in standard operations, making it difficult to imagine the exchange remaining confined to a single controller and a single frequency. Even after examining the procedure step by step, one part of the conversation remains impossible to evaluate from the ground alone. Every operational safeguard discussed so far explains how controllers organize traffic, verify aircraft identities, and respond to unexpected situations, but none of those systems can fully answer what the crew themselves believed was happening inside the cockpit. The radio may carry words between sky and ground, yet it cannot reveal the thoughts, assumptions, or experiences of those speaking them. If the legend rests upon an impossible misunderstanding of time, then the most significant unanswered questions no longer concern the airport or the controller. They concern the people who allegedly continued flying, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Whatever explanation ultimately proves most convincing, it cannot ignore the perspective of those who would have occupied the flight deck during the journey described by the story. Whatever truly happened, or failed to happen, the people inside the cockpit would have carried the only first-hand account of the flight itself, the crew who should have known the truth. Every commercial flight is ultimately remembered through the people who board it, not simply the route it follows or the aircraft that carries it. Long after an airliner has been retired and its flight number reassigned, the individuals connected to a journey often remain the most enduring part of its history. Pilots build careers measured in thousands of flight hours, cabin crews become part of airline records spanning years of service, and passengers leave behind tickets, travel plans, photographs, and families who remember where they were going. Even when an aviation mystery resists explanation, the people at its centre rarely disappear from history as completely as the event itself. That is what makes the legend of Flight 914 increasingly unusual. The closer the investigation moves toward the human side of the story, the more difficult it becomes to identify anyone who can be firmly connected to it. For professional flight crews, a career normally leaves behind a remarkably detailed trail of records. Commercial pilots must obtain licenses, complete recurrent training, satisfy medical certification requirements, and remain qualified on the aircraft they operate. Airlines maintain employment records, assign crews to schedules, and document qualifications that ensure every flight deck is staffed by individuals authorized to perform their duties. Cabin crew members follow similar patterns of training and certification, with their own employment histories reflecting years of service across different routes and aircraft types. While the public rarely sees this administrative framework, it forms an essential part of commercial aviation. The operation of a passenger flight depends not only upon machines, but upon people whose qualifications can be demonstrated and whose professional lives leave extensive documentation. In any investigation involving a scheduled commercial service, identifying the crew would normally become one of the earliest and most straightforward tasks. Strangely, the individual who supposedly commanded Flight 917 remains one of the least defined figures in the entire legend. Despite countless retellings, no consistently verified name emerges for the captain. Some versions avoid identifying the crew altogether, while others introduce names that cannot be traced to reliable historical sources or contemporary aviation records. More importantly, those names often vary between accounts, suggesting they were added during later retellings rather than preserved from original documentation. This absence is particularly striking because airline captains occupy highly visible professional roles. They sign operational documents, communicate with controllers, and assume legal responsibility for the safe conduct of each flight. A captain involved in an event as extraordinary as the one described by the legend would almost certainly become a central figure in any official investigation. Yet the story repeatedly places him at the heart of the mystery without firmly establishing who he was. Beyond the cockpit, the story grows even quieter when attention turns toward those who are said to be sitting in the cabin. Commercial flights are rarely anonymous gatherings. Passengers travel for business, family visits, holidays, education, or countless other personal reasons that connect them to communities waiting at both ends of the journey. Airline reservations, baggage handling, and passenger manifests exist precisely because every seat is expected to belong to someone. Even before electronic booking systems became commonplace, airlines maintained records identifying the individuals travelling on scheduled services. In genuine aviation accidents, passenger lists often become among the earliest pieces of information sought by investigators and families alike, providing names that transform an abstract event into a profoundly human one. Yet within the Flight 914 legend, the passengers remain almost entirely invisible. They are frequently described as a group, but almost never as individuals whose identities can be independently confirmed. An aircraft may be built from metal and machinery, but years of commercial service gradually give it a history shaped by the people who operate it. Pilots remember the aircraft they regularly fly, maintenance technicians document inspections and repairs, and photographers capture images that later become valuable historical references. Individual airframes often accumulate stories of route changes, ownership transfers, refurbishments, and eventual retirement, forming biographies of their own within aviation history. The Douglas DC-4, commonly identified in the Flight 914 legend, is no exception. Many examples have well-documented operational histories reflecting decades of civilian and military service across multiple continents. Yet the legend stops short of connecting its mysterious aircraft to any specific airframe whose documented history can be followed. Instead, it presents an aircraft type without providing the identifying details that would allow historians to distinguish one DC-4 from another. The result is an airplane that appears vivid in imagination while remaining indistinct in the historical record. Taken together, these missing identities reveal a pattern that is difficult to overlook. Throughout the investigation, the legend has repeatedly supplied enough detail to sound convincing, while withholding the information that would make independent verification possible. The route appears familiar. The airport is real. The aircraft type genuinely existed. Air traffic control procedures resemble authentic aviation practice. Yet whenever the search turns toward the people who would normally anchor the story to history, certainty begins to dissolve. No consistently documented captain, no verified crew roster, no authenticated passenger manifest, and no identifiable traveller emerges from the accounts most widely circulated. That contrast is significant because real aviation mysteries, even those that remain unsolved, are almost always remembered through the names of the people involved. History may struggle to explain what happened to them, but it rarely forgets who they were. At some point, the investigation reaches an unexpected conclusion, because it is no longer searching for witnesses, but for the origin of the witnesses themselves. The absence of identifiable individuals suggests that the story may not have lost its human details over time. They may never have existed in a verifiable form to begin with. Every unanswered question now points away from the alleged flight and toward the narrative that carried it across decades of retelling. If the crew cannot be found, the passengers cannot be identified, and the aircraft cannot be tied to a documented history, then the mystery may lie not inside the cockpit but within the story that placed them there. With no verifiable people left to follow, the only trail still open was the one left behind by the story as it spread from one source to another, following the legend back to its source. When witnesses cannot be found, the story itself becomes the only trail left to follow. Every investigation eventually reaches a point where the search for people, places, and physical evidence gives way to something less tangible, but no less revealing. Legends have histories of their own, shaped not by flight paths or official records, but by the ways they are told, repeated, and remembered. If Flight 914 cannot yet be anchored to a verifiable aircraft or an identifiable crew, perhaps its origins can be traced through the path the narrative itself has taken across decades. Unlike the airplane described in the story, this journey did leave behind footprints, though they appear not on runways or in control towers, but on printed pages and later across digital screens. Long before information could circle the world in seconds, unusual tales often travelled slowly through print. During much of the 20th century, stories about unexplained phenomena found audiences through newspapers, popular magazines, paperback collections devoted to mysteries, and publications specialising in the strange or extraordinary. Many readers encountered these accounts without easy access to the original sources they referenced, making independent verification far more difficult than it is today. A dramatic story could therefore migrate from one publication to another, occasionally rewritten, condensed, or expanded along the way. Each retelling reached new audiences who often accepted it at face value because the act of publication itself carried an appearance of authority. Long before search engines allowed readers to compare claims within minutes, stories could circulate for years without anyone tracing them back to where they had first appeared. Tracing the earliest appearance of the Flight 914 legend proves surprisingly more difficult than following the route of the aircraft it describes. Countless modern websites repeat the story with confidence, yet very few identify where they obtained it. Many articles simply reproduce nearly identical wording, suggesting they were copied from earlier versions rather than independently researched. Others cite secondary sources that lead only to additional retellings, creating a chain in which each account points toward another without reaching a contemporary record from the period in which the alleged event supposedly occurred. As investigators move backward through these layers of repetition, the legend begins to resemble a river whose many branches are visible, while its true source remains hidden somewhere upstream. Among the oldest verifiable appearances of the story are publications that were never intended to serve as official historical records. Researchers examining the history of Flight 914 have frequently traced widely circulated versions to sensational publications devoted to unusual claims rather than to contemporary newspapers or aviation journals reporting documented events. One source often mentioned in discussions of the legend is the tabloid Weekly World News, a publication known for presenting extraordinary and fictional stories alongside satire and entertainment. Over time, versions of the Flight 914 account also appeared in books exploring paranormal subjects, unexplained mysteries, and alleged time anomalies. These publications helped introduce the legend to audiences who encountered it not as a carefully sourced historical investigation, but as one remarkable mystery among many. As the story spread further, references to its origins often disappeared, allowing later readers to mistake repetition for independent confirmation. As the legend continued to circulate, each new retelling subtly reshaped the narrative without changing its extraordinary conclusion. Some accounts expanded the dialogue between the pilot and the control tower, adding dramatic exchanges that earlier versions either summarized or omitted entirely. Others adjusted dates, airports, or supporting details while preserving the central claim that an aircraft had somehow crossed decades without its occupants realizing what had happened. These changes reflect a pattern common to many enduring legends. Rather than remaining fixed, the story adapted to the expectations of new audiences, becoming more vivid with each generation of retellings. Details that may once have been ambiguous gradually acquired greater certainty, even when no new documentary evidence accompanied those additions. The arrival of television documentaries and later, the internet transformed the story in ways that earlier publishers could scarcely have imagined. Programs exploring unexplained mysteries introduced Flight 914 to viewers who often encountered it alongside genuine historical enigmas, creating an atmosphere in which fact and folklore could appear remarkably similar. As online forums, personal websites, and video platforms expanded, the legend spread with unprecedented speed. Digital publishing removed many of the barriers that once limited the circulation of unusual claims, allowing identical versions of the story to appear simultaneously across hundreds of websites. Search engines rewarded popularity rather than historical accuracy, meaning that a frequently repeated narrative could become far more visible than a careful examination of its origins. Over time, the sheer volume of references gave the impression that the legend rested upon an extensive historical foundation, even though many of those references ultimately traced back to the same limited pool of earlier retellings. Repetition, however, is not the same as confirmation, and that distinction becomes increasingly important as the investigation continues. Historians distinguish between primary sources, created by people directly connected to an event, and later accounts that rely upon earlier publications. The closer a source stands to the event it describes, the greater its value in reconstructing history. In the case of Flight 944, the investigation repeatedly encounters later retellings, while struggling to identify contemporary documentation produced when the alleged flight supposedly occurred. That imbalance does not merely raise questions about the legend's accuracy, it changes the nature of the mystery itself. The challenge is no longer determining whether the aircraft crossed time, but understanding how a story lacking a clear documentary foundation became accepted by so many as though it had. Viewed in its entirety, the legend begins to resemble a story that accumulated authority through familiarity rather than documentation. Every new appearance strengthened its reputation, not because additional evidence had emerged, but because each retelling reinforced the impression that countless others had already established its credibility. The legend's journey through magazines, books, television, and the internet reveals something almost as fascinating as the story itself: the remarkable ability of repeated narratives to acquire the appearance of history. Yet for all the attention Flight 914 has received, one uncomfortable question refuses to disappear. If the event truly happened, why has the story always been easier to find than the evidence supporting it? For all the places the legend managed to appear, the evidence one would expect it to leave behind remained remarkably absent. The mystery of the missing evidence. Extraordinary events rarely vanish without leaving traces beyond the memories of those who witnessed them. The larger and more unusual an incident becomes, the more people, institutions, and records it tends to involve, creating layers of evidence that remain long after the moment itself has passed. Throughout this investigation, the search has followed aircraft, airports, crews, and even the story's own publication history. Yet each path has ultimately led to the same destination: an absence of verifiable documentation. That absence is not by itself proof that something never happened. History contains genuine events for which records have been lost or destroyed. The question is whether an event as extraordinary as the Flight 915 legend could have unfolded without leaving behind the broad network of evidence that commercial aviation normally creates. One of the first expectations in any aviation mystery is that the appropriate authorities would begin asking questions almost immediately. Civil aviation has long depended upon formal investigation whenever significant irregularities occur, whether involving accidents, serious incidents, or operational events with implications for public safety. The specific agencies responsible vary according to the country and the circumstances, but the principle remains consistent. Extraordinary occurrences are examined because understanding them helps improve aviation safety. An aircraft that allegedly disappeared for decades before unexpectedly returning would present questions unlike any ordinary incident, inviting scrutiny from aviation authorities, airline officials and technical specialists alike. Yet no authenticated investigative report has ever been identified describing an event that matches the central claims of the Flight 914 legend. The absence is especially notable because official investigations are intended not merely to determine what happened, but to preserve a permanent record of events significant enough to affect civil aviation. Beyond official investigations, an event involving a commercial passenger aircraft would ordinarily attract intense public attention. Aviation has always occupied a prominent place in newspapers because commercial flights connect distant cities, carry large numbers of passengers, and symbolize technological progress. Even before the rise of continuous television coverage and online news, major developments in civil aviation regularly appeared in national and international publications. Accidents, emergency landings, disappearances, and remarkable survivals often became front-page stories, followed by weeks or months of additional reporting as new information emerged. A passenger aircraft that supposedly returned after decades would almost certainly have become one of the most extraordinary aviation stories ever reported. Yet despite extensive searches by researchers and aviation historians, no verified contemporary newspaper coverage has surfaced documenting such an arrival. Instead, the story appears only in much later publications devoted to unexplained mysteries, leaving an unexpected gap between the magnitude of the claim and the historical attention it would ordinarily have received. Within the airline itself, an occurrence of this magnitude would extend far beyond the flight deck and the control tower. Commercial airlines function through networks of operational departments responsible for dispatch, maintenance, scheduling, customer service, engineering, and executive oversight. An unexpected aircraft arrival would affect each of these areas in different ways. Maintenance personnel would likely inspect the aircraft, dispatchers would attempt to reconcile its movements with existing records, airline management would coordinate with aviation authorities, and internal communications would document decisions made during the response. Insurance considerations, passenger arrangements, and operational planning could all require additional documentation depending upon the circumstances. While individual records may eventually be archived or discarded according to established retention policies, an event of unprecedented significance would almost certainly leave traces across multiple parts of the organisation. No such authenticated internal documentation has emerged in connection with the Flight 914 legend. No less significant are the people who would have encountered the aircraft after it reached the ground. A commercial airliner does not simply arrive and remain unnoticed once its engines stop. Ground crews marshal aircraft into position, baggage handlers prepare for unloading, maintenance teams respond to technical concerns, fuel personnel coordinate servicing, and airline representatives meet arriving flights according to operational needs. International arrivals also involve airport employees responsible for assisting passengers and coordinating terminal operations. Even if only a portion of those individuals directly interacted with the aircraft, the number of potential witnesses would still be considerable. Over time, memories naturally fade, but extraordinary experiences often survive through interviews, memoirs, local histories, or conversations shared within professional communities. Yet despite the legend's enduring popularity, no verified first-hand testimony from airport personnel has been authenticated as evidence that such an arrival ever occurred. The silence extends beyond official records into the recollections one might reasonably expect such an event to leave behind. Government agencies also become part of the picture whenever an international passenger flight crosses a national border. Immigration officers, customs officials, and other authorities responsible for border control operate alongside airport personnel to process arriving passengers according to established legal procedures. Although those procedures have evolved over the decades, international travel has long required documentation, identifying travellers, aircraft, and points of origin. An aircraft arriving unexpectedly from another country would inevitably intersect with multiple administrative systems beyond aviation alone. Passenger processing, customs declarations, and official correspondence could all generate records reflecting an unusual arrival. No verified evidence of that nature has been connected to the Flight 914 story. Instead, the legend asks listeners to imagine an event so extraordinary that it somehow passed through numerous layers of institutional oversight without leaving a documentary trace that has since been independently verified. Seen individually, each missing record might be explained through ordinary circumstances, but together they create a far more difficult question. Archives can be incomplete, newspapers can omit stories, and individual documents can disappear through accident, neglect, or the passage of time. Historians encounter such gaps regularly, and responsible research always allows for the possibility that evidence remains undiscovered. What makes the Flight 914 legend unusual is not the absence of one particular document, but the apparent absence of every major category of evidence expected from a scheduled commercial flight. No authenticated investigative report, no verified airline documentation, no contemporary newspaper coverage, no confirmed eyewitness testimony, and no independently traceable government record have emerged despite decades of interest in the story. The cumulative weight of those missing pieces gradually shifts the investigation away from asking where the evidence has gone, and toward asking whether it ever existed in the first place. Rather than pointing toward a hidden archive, the investigation begins to suggest that the mystery may have followed an entirely different path from the very beginning. Throughout the search, every avenue has reinforced the same striking contrast. The legend itself has spread widely, while the documentary foundation expected to support it remains elusive. That does not diminish the story's fascination. If anything, it transforms the mystery into something broader than the alleged flight alone. The enduring question is no longer how an aircraft could have crossed decades, but how a narrative with so little verifiable evidence came to be accepted by so many as though it described a forgotten historical event. Somewhere between documented aviation history and modern folklore, another explanation may be waiting, one rooted not in impossible flights, but in the curious ways unusual communications can capture the imagination and grow into enduring legends. If the evidence refused to explain the legend, perhaps the answer lay in understanding how unusual radio transmissions have inspired extraordinary stories before. When radio signals create impossible stories. Although invisible to the eye, radio waves constantly fill the skies through which aircraft travel every day. Every conversation between a pilot and an air traffic controller depends upon signals moving through an environment that cannot be seen, only measured and understood through the principles of physics. To those listening from a cockpit or a control tower, communication often feels immediate and straightforward, yet each transmission must cross an atmosphere that is constantly changing. Most of the time, those changes have little noticeable effect, allowing aviation to function with remarkable reliability. On rarer occasions, however, the behavior of radio signals becomes unexpectedly complex, producing communications that seem strangely out of place until the science behind them is understood. Those genuine anomalies have fascinated pilots and radio operators for decades, not because they suggest impossible journeys through time, but because they demonstrate that the invisible world surrounding every flight can occasionally behave in surprising ways. Under ordinary conditions, aviation communication depends upon frequencies engineered to provide clear and predictable contact between pilots and controllers. Civil aviation primarily relies on very high frequency, or VHF radio for routine air traffic communication, because these signals normally travel in relatively straight lines, making them well suited to the line of sight distances involved in most flights. For operations across oceans or remote regions where VHF coverage becomes impractical, high frequency, or HF, radio has traditionally played an important role. Unlike VHF transmissions, HF signals can interact with the upper layers of Earth's atmosphere, allowing them to travel far beyond the horizon under favourable conditions. These systems were developed with different operational purposes in mind, yet both illustrate an important reality. Aviation communication depends not only upon equipment, but also upon the physical behaviour of radio waves moving through a dynamic environment. Understanding that environment reveals why unusual transmissions occasionally occur even when every person involved is following normal procedures. Nature, however, does not always behave in ordinary ways, and the atmosphere can occasionally alter the path of a radio signal. Radio propagation has been studied for more than a century, revealing that temperature variations, atmospheric conditions, and interactions with the ionosphere can sometimes carry signals much farther than expected. In the case of HF communication, radio waves may reflect from ionized layers high above the Earth, allowing conversations to reach receivers thousands of kilometers away. Under certain circumstances, even VHF transmissions can travel unusually long distances through phenomena such as tropospheric ducting, in which layers of the atmosphere guide radio waves beyond their normal range. To someone unaware of these effects, a distant transmission suddenly appearing on an otherwise familiar frequency can feel deeply unsettling. A voice expected to come from a nearby airport may instead originate hundreds of kilometers away, creating the impression that two entirely different places have briefly shared the same airspace. Documented reports from pilots and radio operators show that unexpected transmissions are not confined to fiction. Amateur radio enthusiasts have long recorded remarkable examples of distant stations becoming audible under favourable atmospheric conditions, sometimes from countries far beyond the normal range of their equipment. Aviation personnel have likewise described occasions when communications from distant aircraft or controllers unexpectedly appeared alongside routine local traffic, particularly during periods of unusual propagation affecting certain frequencies. These experiences are well understood within radio science, even if they remain surprising to those encountering them for the first time. They demonstrate that the atmosphere itself can occasionally produce moments in which voices arrive from unexpected directions without requiring any failure of equipment or extraordinary explanation. Such events remind those working with radio that hearing something unexpected does not necessarily mean something impossible has occurred. Faced with a voice that seems to arrive from the wrong place, the human mind naturally begins searching for explanations that fit the experience. Human perception is remarkably effective at recognizing patterns, yet that same ability can sometimes encourage conclusions that extend beyond the available evidence. A transmission received unexpectedly may first be interpreted as equipment malfunction, interference, or atmospheric propagation by an experienced radio operator. Someone unfamiliar with those possibilities, however, may remember the event very differently, especially if the circumstances were already unusual or emotionally significant. Throughout history, unexplained sounds and mysterious signals have inspired stories ranging from ghostly broadcasts to messages believed to originate from impossible places. In many cases, subsequent investigation revealed entirely natural causes, while in others the precise explanation remained uncertain despite careful study. The important lesson is not that every mystery has been solved, but that unusual communication has repeatedly served as fertile ground for stories that grow more extraordinary with each retelling. Placed beside these genuine phenomena, the Flight 9 Waldhorn legend begins to occupy a different position within the investigation. Nothing in the science of radio propagation suggests that atmospheric conditions can transport an aircraft across decades or cause a pilot and controller to exist in different years. The documented behaviour of radio waves cannot account for the central claim of the legend. What it can explain is why unexpected communications have occasionally inspired confusion, speculation, and lasting folklore. Aviation is an environment where people routinely trust voices they cannot see, often communicating across great distances while depending entirely upon invisible signals moving through the atmosphere. When those signals behave in unexpected ways, even experienced professionals may briefly encounter situations that feel extraordinary before they are understood. The existence of real radio anomalies therefore does not validate the Flight 915 story, but it helps explain why accounts involving mysterious transmissions continue to resonate so strongly with audiences familiar with the hidden complexities of aviation. What these unusual communications ultimately demonstrate is not that aircraft can cross time, but that the hidden behaviour of the atmosphere can occasionally create moments that feel every bit as mysterious. They occupy a fascinating space between science and perception, reminding us that reality is often more surprising than intuition alone would suggest. The atmosphere is capable of bending radio signals in ways that once seemed impossible, and generations of researchers have devoted their work to understanding those behaviours with increasing precision. Yet even after the physics is explained, the emotional impact of hearing an unexpected voice across an otherwise quiet frequency remains remarkably powerful. Perhaps that is one reason legends like Flight 914 continue to endure. They transform a genuine sense of wonder inspired by the hidden behaviour of the natural world into stories that venture beyond established science, inviting listeners to imagine possibilities that evidence has never confirmed. While the legend itself grows increasingly difficult to support through historical investigation, aviation has produced real moments of uncertainty whose surviving radio transmissions are every bit as compelling as fiction. Even so, some of aviation's most unsettling radio messages were transmitted by flights whose mysteries remain real to this day, real flights with unexplained final messages. Some of aviation's greatest mysteries have survived because someone managed to hear the final words before silence followed. Unlike the Flight 914 legend, these are not stories built around anonymous aircraft or undocumented conversations handed down through repeated retellings. They involve real flights, identifiable crews, and transmissions preserved in official records or contemporary accounts. In many cases, investigators eventually reconstructed much of what happened, yet a single message, an unusual phrase, or an unexplained sequence of events continued to resist complete understanding. Those lingering uncertainties have become part of aviation history, demonstrating that genuine mysteries do not require impossible claims to remain deeply compelling. They also provide an opportunity to compare documented enigmas with legends that emerged without the same historical foundation. Among the most enduring examples is the disappearance of the British South American Airways airliner Stardust in 1947. Operating a scheduled international service from Buenos Aires to Santiago, the Avro Lancastrian carried passengers and crew across the Andes, a route already known for its demanding weather and mountainous terrain. As the aircraft approached its destination, the crew communicated with air traffic services and indicated that they believed they were nearing Santiago. Shortly afterward, the radio operator transmitted a final Morse code message consisting of a single unfamiliar word, Stendek, repeated 3 times. Moments later, communication ceased. Despite extensive search efforts, no trace of the aircraft was found, and the disappearance quickly became one of the most puzzling aviation mysteries of its era. For more than half a century, the fate of Stardust remained unknown until the wreckage was eventually discovered high in the Andes, where evidence indicated the aircraft had struck a mountain after a navigational error influenced by powerful high-altitude winds that were not fully understood at the time. For decades, the single word Stendek has occupied a remarkable place in aviation history, precisely because no explanation has achieved universal acceptance. The message itself was copied by experienced radio operators, yet its meaning remains uncertain. Over the years, researchers have proposed numerous possibilities. Some have suggested it may have been an incorrectly transmitted or incorrectly received Morse sequence resulting from fatigue, stress, or difficult transmission conditions. Others have explored whether it could represent an abbreviation or coded reference understood only by the crew, although no convincing documentary evidence has confirmed such interpretations. The discovery of the wreckage helped explain how the aircraft was lost, but it did not resolve the mystery surrounding its final transmission. As a result, Stendek continues to occupy a unique position in aviation history, representing a genuine, unanswered question attached to an otherwise well-documented accident. The mystery survives not because the aircraft itself cannot be identified, but because one final message continues to resist a definitive explanation. Elsewhere in aviation history, investigators have encountered other transmissions that proved puzzling without requiring impossible explanations. Some emergency calls have contained incomplete information because crews were working under rapidly changing circumstances, leaving investigators to reconstruct events from fragmented communications. In other cases, recordings have captured words interrupted by technical difficulties, overlapping transmissions, or deteriorating radio conditions that complicated later interpretation. Aviation accident investigations frequently rely upon cockpit voice recorders, air traffic control recordings, and witness testimony to establish an accurate sequence of events. Yet even with these resources, certain final exchanges remain open to debate. The uncertainty usually arises not from supernatural causes, but from the limitations imposed by time, technology, and the pressures experienced inside a cockpit confronting an emergency. These cases demonstrate that authentic aviation mysteries often emerge from ordinary human communication, occurring under extraordinary circumstances. Unlike the legend of Flight 914, these documented cases begin with aircraft, crews, and investigations whose existence has never been in doubt. The registration of the aircraft is known, the airline can be identified. The route, passengers, operational records, and official inquiries all belong to the historical record, even when some questions remain unanswered. Investigators are therefore able to distinguish between established facts and unresolved uncertainties with considerable confidence. In the case of Stardust, for example, the central mystery concerns the meaning of a final transmission, not whether the flight itself ever departed. The existence of substantial evidence allows researchers to focus on specific unanswered questions while remaining anchored to documented history. By comparison, The Flight 914 legend presents the opposite situation. The extraordinary claim forms the foundation of the story, yet the supporting historical framework expected to accompany such an event remains elusive. Examining these genuine cases highlights how authentic mysteries and enduring legends can appear similar on the surface, while resting upon fundamentally different foundations. Viewed side by side, these documented cases highlight an important distinction between genuine unsolved events and legends that develop through later retellings. Real aviation investigations often reduce uncertainty over time as new evidence is discovered, technology improves, or previously inaccessible locations are examined. The discovery of stardust after decades beneath glacial ice illustrates how patient investigation can eventually answer questions once thought impossible to resolve. At the same time, certain details may continue to defy complete explanation, preserving a measure of mystery even after the broader event has been understood. Legends tend to move in the opposite direction. Rather than becoming clearer through accumulating evidence, they often become richer through repeated retelling, with new details appearing despite the absence of new documentation. That distinction helps explain why genuine aviation mysteries remain both fascinating and credible. They acknowledge the limits of current knowledge without abandoning the discipline of historical investigation. Perhaps this is why aviation folklore continues to grow alongside aviation history, drawing inspiration from genuine mysteries while gradually reshaping them into something far more extraordinary. Stories like Stardust remind us that reality is capable of producing moments every bit as haunting as fiction, from cryptic final messages to disappearances that remain unsolved for decades before yielding unexpected answers. Those authentic events provide fertile ground for imagination, encouraging later generations to ask larger questions about the skies, communication, and the unknown. Over time, the boundary between documented mystery and popular legend can become increasingly difficult for casual audiences to recognize, especially when both are told with equal confidence. The investigation into Flight 914 has repeatedly shown how important that distinction can be. Genuine mysteries invite careful examination because they are supported by evidence, even when that evidence leaves important questions unanswered. Legends invite a different kind of investigation, one that seeks to understand not only what people believe, but how those beliefs take shape and endure. Looking across aviation history, both kinds of stories continue to coexist, each reflecting a different aspect of humanity's enduring fascination with flight and the unexplained. Yet not every enduring aviation mystery began with a radio transmission, because some started with reports of aircraft appearing where no one expected to see them. Reports of aircraft that shouldn't have been there. Across decades of aviation, there have been moments when an aircraft seemed to appear where neither pilots nor controllers expected it to be. Unlike stories that exist only through repeated retellings, these incidents were documented by professionals responsible for maintaining order in some of the world's busiest skies. In many cases, the mystery lasted only minutes before an explanation emerged. In others, uncertainty remained even after investigators reviewed the available evidence. Such events do not demonstrate that aircraft can travel through time or vanish from history, but they reveal that aviation occasionally produces situations in which observation, technology, and human judgment briefly fall out of alignment. Those moments have become part of aviation's long history of unanswered questions, reminding both pilots and controllers that the skies can still present surprises despite decades of technological progress. From the perspective of an air traffic controller, the sky is assembled from voices, radar returns, and constant observation. Every aircraft under control is identified through a combination of radio communication, transponder information, flight plans, and radar data, allowing controllers to build a continuously updated picture of the airspace around them. Pilots contribute another perspective by reporting weather, confirming visual contact with nearby traffic, and responding to instructions from the ground. Most of the time, these independent sources reinforce one another, creating a remarkably accurate understanding of where every aircraft is located. Yet the system depends upon information arriving in the correct place at the correct moment. When one element briefly conflicts with another, even experienced professionals may find themselves confronting a situation that cannot immediately be explained. Occasionally, a radar screen presents an image that cannot be immediately matched to an identifiable aircraft. Radar technology has advanced enormously since its earliest applications, but operators have long understood that unusual returns can sometimes appear for reasons unrelated to an actual aircraft. Atmospheric conditions may bend radar beams in unexpected ways, producing anomalous propagation that causes distant objects or ground features to appear where they should not. Weather formations, reflections, and equipment characteristics can also generate returns requiring careful interpretation before any operational conclusions are drawn. For that reason, radar information is rarely considered in isolation. Controllers routinely compare radar data with flight plans, transponder codes, radio communications, and reports from nearby aircraft before determining whether an unidentified return represents genuine traffic or a phenomenon requiring further assessment. The existence of these procedures reflects a simple reality. Not every unexplained radar contact represents an unexplained aircraft. Several documented reports describe encounters in which experienced flight crews observed traffic that remained difficult to identify at the time. In some instances, pilots reported lights or aircraft that did not appear on available traffic information, while controllers were unable to immediately correlate those observations with known flights. Other reports involved aircraft detected on radar before subsequently disappearing or proving difficult to classify using the information available at that moment. Investigations into such incidents often identified conventional explanations, including military operations, weather effects, equipment limitations, or incomplete situational awareness between different parts of the aviation system. Yet not every report reached an entirely satisfying conclusion. Aviation authorities have acknowledged that a small number of sightings remain difficult to explain fully because the available evidence was incomplete or contradictory. These cases demonstrate that uncertainty can arise even within highly structured environments built upon careful observation and verification. What makes these incidents especially compelling is not the suggestion of the supernatural, but the uncertainty they created among trained observers. Pilots and controllers spend years developing the skills required to interpret rapidly changing situations, distinguish meaningful information from background noise, and make decisions under pressure. Their training emphasizes disciplined observation rather than speculation, which is precisely why reports of unexplained sightings attract careful attention. An experienced pilot is unlikely to describe an object as unidentified simply because it appears unfamiliar. That conclusion is generally reached only after ordinary possibilities have been considered. Likewise, controllers routinely verify unusual radar returns before treating them as genuine traffic. These professional habits do not eliminate uncertainty altogether, but they ensure that unexplained reports emerge from cautious assessment rather than immediate assumption. The resulting accounts therefore occupy an unusual place in aviation history, balancing disciplined investigation with an acknowledgement that not every observation can be fully resolved. Examining these accounts alongside the Flight 914 legend reveals a contrast that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Documented sightings begin with identifiable witnesses, known locations, and specific moments that can be investigated using available evidence. Even when investigators cannot determine exactly what was observed, they can often establish who reported it, when it occurred, and what information was available at the time. Those facts provide a foundation upon which uncertainty can be honestly evaluated. The Flight 9 A4T story, by contrast, asks the audience to accept an extraordinary conclusion without the same supporting framework of verifiable observation. Throughout this investigation, each comparison has pointed toward the same pattern. Genuine aviation mysteries tend to preserve evidence while leaving certain questions unanswered. The legend reverses that relationship, preserving the extraordinary claim while offering remarkably little evidence that the event itself ever occurred. That distinction does not diminish the fascination surrounding Flight 9 Off Dawn, but it places the story in a fundamentally different category from the documented incidents that continue to challenge aviation historians. Beneath every unresolved sighting lies a reminder that aviation sometimes produces questions before it produces answers. The skies remain an environment where technology, weather, geography, and human perception interact in ways that occasionally resist immediate explanation. Investigators have learned that patience, careful documentation, and a willingness to revise initial assumptions often provide answers that seemed impossible during the first moments of confusion. At the same time, some reports remain incomplete because crucial evidence was never recorded or has not survived. Those lingering uncertainties are part of aviation's history, not because they prove extraordinary theories, but because they reflect the practical limits of observation in a complex environment. They also reveal why stories like Flight 914 continue to resonate. real aviation has produced enough genuine mysteries to remind us that uncertainty is sometimes unavoidable, even when everyone involved is committed to discovering exactly what happened. For a handful of crews, however, the most unsettling uncertainty began only after they tried to measure how much time had actually passed. Pilots who lost time. Few experiences are more unsettling for a flight crew than realizing a journey does not seem to match the passage of time they expected. In aviation, time is more than a way of marking the hours. It determines fuel planning, navigation, arrival estimates, and countless operational decisions made both in the cockpit and on the ground. Every stage of a flight is measured against carefully calculated expectations, leaving little room for uncertainty. Yet experienced pilots have occasionally described flights that felt strangely compressed, unexpectedly prolonged, or difficult to reconcile with their own sense of how much time had passed. These accounts do not suggest that clocks ceased functioning or that aircraft somehow crossed into another era. Instead, they reveal that the experience of time in flight can sometimes become unexpectedly difficult to interpret, creating moments that linger in memory long after the journey has ended. Precision in aviation depends as much upon accurate timekeeping as it does upon altitude, speed, or direction. Before satellite navigation transformed long-distance flying, crews often relied upon techniques that combined heading, airspeed, wind estimates, and carefully monitored elapsed time to determine their position. Even with today's advanced navigation systems, estimated times of arrival, fuel calculations, and air traffic sequencing continue to depend upon accurate measurements of time. Pilots constantly compare planned progress with actual performance, adjusting expectations as weather, winds, and routing change throughout the flight. Because so many operational decisions rely upon those calculations, even relatively small discrepancies attract attention. A flight arriving significantly earlier or later than anticipated is rarely dismissed as a curiosity. Instead, crews examine the conditions that influenced the journey, looking for explanations grounded in weather patterns, routing changes, or aircraft performance, rather than assuming that something impossible has occurred. Historical flight records contain occasions when aircraft completed journeys noticeably faster or slower than crews had anticipated. One of the most familiar explanations involves the powerful jet streams that circle the planet at high altitude. Aircraft flying with exceptionally strong tailwinds may reach their destinations far sooner than expected, while those encountering equally powerful headwinds can experience unexpectedly long journeys despite following the same route. These differences are entirely consistent with atmospheric science, yet they can still feel remarkable to those on board, particularly when the change is substantial. On other occasions, revised air traffic routings, changing weather, or navigation around storms have extended flights well beyond their original estimates. Although these variations are measurable and thoroughly understood, they demonstrate that time in aviation is shaped by far more than the simple movement of a clock. The conditions surrounding a flight can alter its duration in ways that feel surprising, even when every explanation remains firmly rooted in physics. Inside the cockpit, the perception of time can shift in subtle ways during periods of intense workload, changing weather, or prolonged concentration. Aviation psychologists have long recognized that human perception of time is influenced by attention, stress, fatigue, and cognitive workload. During critical phases of flight, pilots may become so focused on navigation, communication, weather avoidance, or aircraft management that their subjective awareness of time changes dramatically. Minutes can seem to disappear while attention remains fixed upon immediate tasks, whereas periods of uncertainty or prolonged waiting may feel considerably longer than the clock would suggest. These effects are not unique to aviation, but the demanding environment of flight can make them particularly noticeable. They remind us that the experience of time is not always identical to its measurement. A crew may accurately complete every operational task, while later remembering the passage of the flight quite differently from what the instruments ultimately recorded. Measured against these documented experiences, the Flight 9114 legend becomes easier to place within a broader aviation context. Aviation has produced genuine situations in which flight duration, navigation, or personal perception seemed unusual enough to leave lasting impressions on those involved. None of those documented cases, however, required investigators to conclude that time itself had been crossed. Instead, they reflected the complex interaction between atmospheric conditions, operational demands, and human perception. That distinction is essential. The real experiences demonstrate that aviation is capable of producing events that feel extraordinary without abandoning the known principles governing flight. The legend of Flight 914 takes those familiar elements and extends them into a claim that no verified evidence has been able to support. Recognizing that difference allows the documented experiences to remain fascinating in their own right, without asking them to explain something they were never intended to prove. Stories rarely emerge from ordinary flights, but unusual experiences have always encouraged people to search for equally unusual explanations. Throughout history, moments that seem difficult to understand at first have often inspired speculation, reaching far beyond the available evidence. A surprisingly short journey, a confusing navigation problem, or an unexpected communication may gradually become something larger as it is retold, especially when later audiences encounter only the most dramatic parts of the account. Aviation provides fertile ground for this process because it combines advanced technology with environments that remain vast, remote, and sometimes unforgiving. Most passengers never witness the calculations, weather analysis, or operational decisions unfolding inside the cockpit, making it easier for extraordinary outcomes to acquire an air of mystery. Over time, genuine experiences shaped by natural forces can become the starting point for stories that imagine far more remarkable possibilities than the original events ever suggested. Beyond the technical details, these accounts reveal something enduring about the relationship between aviation and the human imagination. Flight has always occupied a unique place in human history, shrinking distances while carrying people into an environment that remains largely invisible from the ground. Clouds conceal landscapes, horizons stretch beyond ordinary experience, and time zones alter the relationship between clocks and daylight in ways that can already feel unfamiliar. Within that setting, even routine journeys possess the ability to challenge intuition. When something genuinely unusual occurs, whether a cryptic radio message, an unexpected radar contact, or a flight whose duration surprises those aboard, it naturally captures attention in ways that similar events in other settings might not. The enduring appeal of stories like Flight 914 lies partly in this environment, where the ordinary experience of flight already asked people to trust instruments, invisible signals, and calculations carried out beyond the view of those on the ground. The leap from documented anomaly to impossible legend is a human one, shaped as much by imagination as by the event itself, an understanding that process brings the investigation closer to explaining why such stories continue to endure long after the evidence has faded. From that intersection of genuine experience and imagination grew some of aviation's most persistent stories about journeys that seem to cross more than distance alone. Why aviation keeps producing time travel legends. Legends rarely remain confined to the events that first inspired them, because every retelling has the power to reshape uncertain experiences into stories that feel larger, stranger, and far more enduring than the historical record alone might suggest. Aviation has proven especially fertile ground for this process. Since the earliest decades of powered flight, airplanes have carried people into environments that most of humanity experiences only from a distance, where familiar landmarks disappear beneath cloud cover, radio voices replace face-to-face conversation, and vast stretches of ocean or wilderness leave crews isolated from immediate observation. Within that setting, even an ordinary journey can feel detached from everyday life. When an unusual event occurs, whether it involves an unexplained transmission, an unexpected sighting, or an experience that seems difficult to reconcile with memory, it rarely remains confined to those who witnessed it. Instead, the story begins a second journey, one shaped not by navigation charts or flight plans, but by the imagination of everyone who hears it afterward. Few inventions have transformed humanity's relationship with distance as completely as the airplane. For most of history, travel unfolded gradually, allowing landscapes to change almost imperceptibly over days or weeks. Flight altered that experience in ways that often felt extraordinary, even when everything proceeded exactly as planned. A passenger could leave one continent beneath the morning sun and arrive in another where the calendar, the clock, or even the season appeared different. Crossing multiple time zones compressed experiences that had once required long voyages into a matter of hours, making time itself seem strangely flexible despite following entirely predictable physical laws. To those unfamiliar with the mechanics of global travel, such experiences could already feel almost unreal. Aviation therefore introduced millions of people to journeys that challenged ordinary intuition, creating an ideal backdrop for stories in which time seemed capable of behaving in even more extraordinary ways. Conversations exchanged between aircraft and the ground possess a unique quality that few other forms of communication can replicate. Throughout much of a flight, passengers rarely see the people guiding the aircraft from control centres hundreds of kilometres away, and controllers never see the faces of the crews responding to their instructions. The relationship depends almost entirely upon voices transmitted through invisible radio waves, separated from the visual cues that normally accompany human conversation. A calm instruction or an unexpected report may travel across mountains, oceans, or entire regions before reaching its destination, carrying with it a sense of distance that naturally lends itself to mystery. When unusual radio exchanges become part of an aviation story, listeners often imagine the unseen world surrounding those voices, filling the gaps with possibilities that extend far beyond the limited information contained in the original transmission. That psychological effect helps explain why radio communication has become such a powerful element in aviation folklore, including legends that imagine conversations taking place across impossible spans of time. Centuries before powered flight became possible, tales involving missing time already existed in many parts of the world. Folklore from different cultures contained stories of travellers who believed they had spent only a short period away, only to discover that far more time had passed than they realised. Other traditions describe mysterious journeys into unfamiliar places, where ordinary rules seemed briefly suspended before the travellers returned to find that the world had changed in unexpected ways. These stories emerged long before aircraft, radio, or modern technology, suggesting that the fascination with altered time is much older than aviation itself. Flight did not create that fascination. Instead, it provided a compelling modern setting in which ancient storytelling themes could be expressed through contemporary imagery. Where earlier generations imagined enchanted forests, hidden valleys, or distant kingdoms, the modern imagination found equally mysterious possibilities among clouds, navigation routes, and aircraft disappearing beyond the horizon. Taken in that wider context, the Flight 914 story begins to resemble a modern expression of much older storytelling traditions. It combines several themes that have repeatedly appeared in folklore while adapting them to the technological world of commercial aviation. There is the unexpected disappearance, the unexplained return, the apparent passage of time experienced differently by those involved, and the authoritative figures who struggle to understand what they have witnessed. The presence of an aircraft simply replaces older forms of transportation without changing the underlying structure of the narrative. At the same time, aviation lends these familiar ideas an unusual degree of credibility because airplanes operate within systems that most people assume are carefully documented and continuously monitored. The suggestion that something could bypass those systems without explanation creates a tension between modern expectations and timeless storytelling patterns, allowing the legend to feel simultaneously contemporary and ancient. Certain narratives continue circulating because they satisfy a curiosity that straightforward answers often cannot. Psychological research has shown that people are naturally drawn to stories containing unresolved questions, particularly when those stories involve familiar settings interrupted by extraordinary events. A mystery that remains partially unexplained encourages continued discussion because each listener imagines a different solution, keeping the narrative alive long after more ordinary accounts have been forgotten. Flight 914 illustrates this tendency remarkably well. The legend presents an impossible claim while leaving enough unanswered questions for audiences to supply their own interpretations. Some imagine secret experiments, others speculate about unknown physical phenomena, and still others view the story as a cautionary tale about the limits of human understanding. The lack of verifiable evidence has done little to diminish its popularity, because the story's appeal depends less upon historical confirmation than upon its ability to stimulate imagination. Looking beyond the individual details reveals that the legend owes much of its endurance to familiar patterns found throughout folklore. It emerged during a period when commercial aviation symbolized technological progress, global exploration, and humanity's growing confidence in mastering the skies. Yet those same qualities also made aircraft ideal subjects for stories reminding audiences that some mysteries might remain beyond complete understanding. Throughout this investigation, the evidence has consistently pointed toward the same conclusion. The historical record offers no convincing support for the extraordinary events described in the Flight 914 legend, while the broader history of aviation provides numerous authentic mysteries that demonstrate how easily uncertainty can inspire remarkable stories. The enduring popularity of the legend therefore says less about an impossible flight through time than it does about the enduring relationship between human curiosity and the unknown. As long as people continue crossing invisible routes through distant skies guided by voices they cannot see, aviation will remain a natural home for stories that blur the boundaries between reality, memory, and imagination. Only one avenue of the investigation now remains: whether the known laws governing space and time offer even the smallest foundation for such an extraordinary idea. Could physics explain any part of it? Curiosity inevitably reaches a point where folklore gives way to science, inviting an entirely different kind of investigation into what may or may not be possible. Throughout history, humanity has looked toward the unknown and searched for explanations that could transform mystery into understanding. Aviation has become one of the clearest examples of this relationship between imagination and discovery, because flight itself was once considered impossible before engineers and scientists turned it into reality. As aircraft began carrying people across continents and oceans, questions about speed, distance, and time naturally followed. Stories involving missing years, impossible journeys, and aircraft returning from another era often borrow the language of science to make extraordinary claims feel more plausible. Yet the same scientific principles that reveal the universe to be stranger than everyday experience also establish boundaries that cannot simply be crossed by imagination alone. Understanding those boundaries is essential when examining whether any part of the Flight 914 legend resembles something recognized by modern physics. Albert Einstein's theory of relativity fundamentally changed humanity's understanding of time without turning it into something that could be crossed at will. Before the development of relativity, time was commonly viewed as a universal constant that moved at the same rate everywhere in the universe. Einstein's work revealed a far more complex picture, showing that measurements of time can depend on factors such as relative motion and gravity. Under specific conditions, two observers can experience different amounts of elapsed time, while both remain correct according to their own reference frames. This phenomenon, known as time dilation, has been repeatedly confirmed through precise scientific experiments and is a fundamental part of modern physics. However, the existence of time dilation is often misunderstood when removed from its scientific context. Relativity does not suggest that an aircraft can disappear into the past and return decades later. Instead, it describes subtle differences in the passage of time that become significant only under extreme conditions involving enormous speeds or intense gravitational fields. Experiments carried aboard aircraft have demonstrated that the passage of time is not perfectly identical under every condition, even though the differences remain extraordinarily small. Scientists have used highly accurate atomic clocks to measure these effects, including experiments involving clocks transported on aircraft and compared with clocks that remained on the ground. The results confirmed predictions made by relativity, showing that motion and gravity can produce measurable differences in elapsed time. These findings are among the most precise demonstrations of how closely modern technology can measure the behavior of time itself. Yet the scale of these effects is crucial. A commercial aircraft traveling at normal speeds does not experience a dramatic separation from the rest of the world. The difference between a clock aboard an aircraft and one on the ground amounts to tiny fractions of a second, not years or decades. The science is real, the measurements are real, but the effect exists on a scale completely different from the impossible journey described in the Flight 914 legend. Electromagnetic fields, atmospheric conditions, and other natural phenomena have often been drawn into discussions of aviation mysteries despite serving very different roles in established science. Because aircraft operate within a complex environment, filled with radio signals, magnetic fields, and changing atmospheric conditions, it is understandable why some unusual aviation experiences are sometimes connected to scientific ideas that appear mysterious. Electromagnetic interference can affect equipment, atmospheric conditions can influence communication, and natural variations can create unexpected readings or observations. These phenomena have played genuine roles in aviation investigations, but none are known to create pathways through time or allow aircraft to bypass normal physical processes. The atmosphere can distort signals, alter perception, and complicate navigation, yet it continues to operate within the same physical laws that govern every flight. The difference between a strange event and an impossible event lies not in whether the world contains mysteries, but in whether the proposed explanation matches what science has actually observed. Scientific terminology frequently acquires a second life outside the laboratory, where familiar concepts can gradually become detached from their original meaning. Words such as relativity, quantum, and dimensions often appear in discussions of extraordinary claims because they represent areas of science that already challenge everyday intuition. However, scientific complexity does not mean that every imagined possibility becomes physically realistic. Relativity does not mean all forms of time travel are possible. Quantum mechanics does not suggest that ordinary objects can freely move between alternate realities. These fields describe carefully tested behaviors of nature, supported by mathematical frameworks and experimental evidence. When scientific terms are removed from that context, they can become powerful storytelling tools, lending an appearance of credibility to ideas that have little connection to the original discoveries. The Flight 9 Wolfthorn legend reflects this broader pattern, where the mystery of aviation becomes intertwined with scientific concepts that sound related, but do not actually provide an explanation. Applying these established principles to the Flight 9 Wolfthorn legend reveals both the remarkable achievements of modern physics and the clear limits of what current evidence allows us to conclude. Science has shown that time is not as simple as human experience suggests. It has demonstrated that clocks can differ, that gravity affects measurements, and that motion influences the passage of time. These discoveries are genuinely extraordinary, but they do not support the idea that an aircraft can vanish from one decade and appear in another. The difference is not a lack of imagination within science. In many ways, reality has already proven more surprising than earlier generations expected. The difference is that scientific discoveries are constrained by observation, testing, and evidence. The Flight 914 legend asks for a phenomenon far beyond anything measured or demonstrated, requiring not only an unusual event but a complete violation of the physical processes that govern aircraft, communication, and time itself. The deeper mystery is not whether science confirms the legend, but how genuine discoveries about the universe can become even more extraordinary when separated from their original context. Throughout history, new scientific ideas have often inspired both understanding and speculation, especially when they reveal aspects of reality that seem impossible from an everyday perspective. Aviation itself followed this pattern. The first aircraft were once symbols of impossible dreams before becoming ordinary tools of transportation, proving that imagination can sometimes predict future discoveries. Yet the same imagination can also move in the opposite direction, transforming real scientific concepts into explanations for events that evidence does not support. The endurance of stories like Flight 914 comes partly from this tension between what science has revealed and what people continue to wonder about. The universe contains unanswered questions, but those questions become meaningful only when curiosity remains connected to careful investigation. The mystery is not that science has failed to explain an impossible flight, but that human beings continue searching for extraordinary possibilities within a world that is already far more complex than it first appears. Once scientific concepts become intertwined with a compelling narrative, it becomes easier to understand how fiction can gradually acquire the appearance of historical fact, how a fiction became accepted as history. An unusual claim can take on a life of its own when repetition gradually replaces the need for verification. The Flight 914 legend demonstrates how a story can move far beyond the circumstances of its creation, surviving not because new evidence continues to appear, but because each retelling gives it another opportunity to reach a new audience. The absence of official records should have prevented such a remarkable claim from becoming widely accepted, yet the story continued travelling through different forms of media, adapting to changing times while preserving the same central mystery. Like many legends, it gained strength from the very question surrounding it. The more impossible the claim appeared, the more compelling it became, creating a cycle where curiosity encouraged further discussion, and further discussion made the story feel increasingly familiar. Eventually, familiarity itself began to resemble credibility, allowing an unsupported account to occupy the same space in public memory as events supported by historical documentation. Through countless retellings, mysterious accounts can slowly transform from uncertain reports into stories that audiences remember as established events. This process rarely happens through a single moment or a single source. Instead, legends often develop gradually as information passes between people, publications, broadcasts, and later digital platforms. Details may become more specific with each version, even when the original evidence remains unclear or non-existent. A vague claim can eventually acquire precise-sounding elements such as dates, locations, names, and official involvement, giving later audiences the impression that the story must have originated from a documented incident. Yet those additions are not always the result of deliberate invention. In many cases, they emerge because repeated storytellers naturally attempt to complete missing pieces, turning an incomplete account into a more satisfying narrative. The result is a mystery that feels increasingly detailed while becoming further separated from whatever facts may have existed at the beginning. Before online platforms changed the speed of communication, printed publications and broadcasts already played a powerful role in shaping public fascination with unexplained stories. Newspapers, magazines, and television programs helped introduce audiences to unusual claims that might otherwise have remained limited to small groups of readers or local discussions. Stories involving strange disappearances, unexplained encounters, and unusual phenomena were particularly effective because they combined recognizable settings with questions that appeared difficult to answer. Aviation mysteries held a special appeal because airplanes represented both human achievement and unknown territory. A missing aircraft suggested danger, uncertainty, and the possibility of hidden explanations. Within that environment, a story involving a vanished passenger plane and an impossible return contained many of the elements that made mysteries attractive to audiences. The dramatic nature of the claim allowed it to stand out, even without the supporting records that would normally accompany such an extraordinary event. Tracing the path of a legend often requires examining not only where it appeared, but also how each retelling altered the way people understood it. One of the challenges surrounding Flight 94 is that versions of the story have circulated in different forms, making it difficult to identify a single authoritative origin. The account has commonly been associated with sensational publications, particularly those known for presenting unusual and extraordinary claims, but the details surrounding its earliest appearance remain difficult to establish with certainty. This lack of a clear beginning created a unique problem. Without an easily identifiable original source, later versions could appear to confirm one another simply because they repeated similar elements. Readers encountering the story years after its first circulation might assume that multiple references indicated multiple confirmations when they were often variations of the same unsupported claim moving through different channels. The uncertainty surrounding sources became one of the most important reasons the legend continued to survive. A story attached to a specific document, investigation, or official record can be examined and either supported or challenged. A story passed through unnamed reports and vague references is much harder to evaluate because the absence of a clear origin leaves room for speculation. Claims that a government agency investigated an event, that officials witnessed something unusual, or that records were hidden can make a mystery appear larger, while also making verification more difficult. When audiences cannot easily locate the original evidence, they may rely on the existence of the story itself as a form of proof. The fact that people have heard the account repeatedly can begin to feel like evidence that something must have happened, even though repetition only demonstrates that the story was successful at spreading. Digital archives and social platforms created a new environment where old mysteries could return, spread rapidly, and reach audiences far removed from their original source. The internet did not create the Flight 914 legend, but it transformed the way such stories survive. A claim that once depended on limited publication space or scheduled broadcasts could now be copied, shared, discussed, and rediscovered almost indefinitely. Each new appearance could remove important context, leaving behind only the most dramatic version of the story. Images, headlines, and short summaries often travel faster than explanations, allowing a mysterious claim to become familiar before audiences encounter information questioning its authenticity. In this environment, the distance between entertainment, speculation, and historical fact can become increasingly difficult to recognize. especially when a story is presented without the surrounding context needed to evaluate it. Human curiosity tends to preserve certain mysteries longer than ordinary events, particularly when a story offers an unanswered question that encourages people to search for explanations. The Flight 914 legend contains a powerful combination of elements that naturally attract attention: a missing aircraft, an impossible timeline, unanswered questions, and the suggestion that something hidden exists beyond the available evidence. These qualities make the story memorable because they invite audiences to participate in solving the mystery themselves. A confirmed explanation often brings a story to an end, but an unresolved mystery can continue generating discussion for generations. The absence of proof becomes part of the fascination rather than the reason to dismiss the claim. In this way, the legend survives not because it has overcome the lack of evidence, but because the lack of evidence has become one of the central features of the story itself. At its core, the Flight 914 mystery reveals how an unsupported claim can become culturally significant, even when the evidence behind it remains absent. Its journey reflects a broader pattern found throughout folklore and modern urban legends, where stories evolve through repetition until the boundary between entertainment and history becomes increasingly unclear. The aircraft described in the legend left behind no confirmed records, no verified investigation, and no documented event matching the extraordinary claim. Yet the story itself travelled widely, passing between generations and adapting to new forms of communication. Its endurance reveals something important about how people interact with mystery. Humans are not only interested in what can be proven, they're also drawn to possibilities, unanswered questions, and narratives that challenge their understanding of the world. Flight 915 remains famous not because the evidence supports it, but because the story managed to become larger than the evidence ever was. Modern aviation now operates in a world of constant tracking and recorded communication, creating a completely different landscape for any mystery that attempts to disappear without leaving a trace. If Flight 914 appeared today, aviation in the present era operates through an unprecedented web of tracking, communication, and verification that would make a disappearance like the one described in the legend immediately visible. The world that produced the Flight 915 story was one where information moved more slowly, records were less accessible, and vast portions of the planet remained difficult to monitor in real time. Today, a commercial aircraft does not simply travel from one location to another. It exists within a constantly connected system of flight plans, digital signals, satellite networks, communication channels, and operational records that follow its movement from departure to arrival. The idea of a passenger aircraft vanishing completely and returning years later would not only challenge our understanding of time, but also collide with a technological environment designed to document nearly every stage of a journey. The mystery would begin not with a missing aircraft, but with an immediate question: where did the evidence trail begin, and why would every system designed to record the flight say something different? The first moments after an unidentified aircraft appeared would likely be defined not by mystery, but by a rapid search for matching records and confirmed information. Modern aviation depends on constant coordination between aircraft operators, air traffic controllers, and multiple monitoring systems that help maintain safety across increasingly crowded skies. An aircraft entering controlled airspace would be expected to provide identifiable information through established communication procedures and tracking technology. Controllers would compare its reported identity, location, altitude, and route with existing flight information to determine whether the aircraft matched a known operation. A discrepancy would immediately attract attention, not because authorities would assume something impossible had occurred, but because aviation systems are built around resolving inconsistencies quickly. An aircraft with no matching flight plan, no recognizable registration, or no expected operational history would represent a serious anomaly requiring investigation long before anyone considered extraordinary explanations. Beneath the constant movement of commercial flights, automated systems continuously exchange data that allows aircraft positions and identities to be monitored across the globe. One of the most significant developments in modern aviation tracking is automatic dependent surveillance broadcast, commonly known as ADS-B, which allows equipped aircraft to transmit information such as position, altitude, velocity, and identification details. Unlike older methods that relied more heavily on radar detection from specific locations, ADS-B allows aircraft information to be shared through a broader network involving ground stations and satellites. This technology has transformed how aviation authorities understand the movement of aircraft, particularly in regions where traditional radar coverage may be limited. A flight crossing an ocean or travelling through remote areas no longer exists in complete isolation. Instead, its journey becomes part of a larger stream of information that can be reviewed, compared, and analysed after the aircraft has reached its destination. For a legend involving an aircraft appearing without a trace, this creates a fundamental problem. Modern flights are expected to leave behind evidence before they ever reach their destination. Remote stretches of the planet that once represented gaps in aviation awareness are now connected through satellites, digital communication, and global monitoring networks. Oceans, deserts, and polar regions have historically represented some of the greatest challenges for aviation tracking, because ground-based systems cannot cover every location equally. However, satellite technology has expanded the ability to monitor aircraft beyond traditional boundaries, reducing the number of places where a flight can travel completely unseen. Communication systems have also improved, allowing crews and operators to maintain contact over distances that once created significant uncertainty. While technology does not eliminate every aviation challenge, it has changed the relationship between aircraft and the outside world. The isolated journeys that once inspired stories of disappearances now take place within a far more connected environment, where unusual events are surrounded by layers of information waiting to be examined. Every routine flight creates thousands of digital traces that reveal where an aircraft came from, where it has been, and how it reached its destination. Before an aircraft ever leaves the ground, it is connected to records involving registration, ownership, maintenance, scheduling, and operational planning. During the journey, communications, tracking data, and air traffic information create additional records that can later be reviewed by investigators. Even after landing, the aircraft remains connected to a history that can be examined through airline documentation and aviation databases. This evidence trail is one of the defining characteristics of modern air travel. A genuine aircraft arriving from another year would not simply need to appear physically. It would also need to somehow exist outside the enormous network of records normally created by every aircraft operation. The challenge would not only be explaining where the aircraft came from, but also explaining how it avoided leaving behind the information that modern aviation depends upon. If a passenger plane somehow arrived carrying a history that did not match any known record, investigators would immediately face a question unlike any ordinary aviation mystery. They would begin by examining the details that define every legitimate aircraft: its registration, manufacturer records, maintenance history, ownership information, and communication history. Aviation investigations are built around reconstructing events from evidence, whether examining accidents, technical failures, or unusual occurrences. The same approach would apply to an aircraft making an impossible claim about its origin. Investigators would not need to begin with the assumption that time travel had occurred. They would first look for explanations involving incorrect identification, communication errors, incomplete records, or other conventional causes. Only after exhausting those possibilities would they confront the extraordinary nature of the claim itself. Modern investigation does not remove mystery entirely, but it changes the way mystery begins. The first step is no longer searching through uncertainty. It is searching through an overwhelming amount of information. The contrast between the Flight 915 legend and contemporary aviation is found in the evidence gap, because today's aircraft leave behind records at nearly every stage of their journey. The original legend depends heavily on the idea of a flight existing outside normal documentation, with the lack of records becoming part of the mystery. In the modern aviation environment, however, missing information would itself become a significant clue. An aircraft without a digital history, operational records, or communication trail would not appear as an ordinary flight that somehow disappeared. It would immediately become an unprecedented investigation, involving multiple aviation organizations and technical systems. The world has changed dramatically since the era in which stories of impossible flights gained attention. Technology has not made aviation completely predictable, and unexpected events still occur, but it has made the disappearance of evidence far more difficult than before. Yet the continued popularity of the Flight 915 legend reveals something beyond the capabilities of technology. The story survives because it represents a question rather than an event. It invites people to imagine what might happen if the systems designed to explain the world suddenly failed. Modern aviation is built on precision, communication, and records, but legends often emerge from the spaces where those things appear incomplete. The appeal of Flight 914 does not come from documented proof that an aircraft crossed time. It comes from the tension between a world where everything should be traceable and the human fascination with imagining what would happen if something truly escaped explanation. In reality, a modern investigation would likely uncover countless records before uncovering any impossible answer. Yet the idea remains powerful, because the possibility of the unknown continues to exist, even in an age where almost everything appears visible. Despite the strength of modern tracking systems, the legend continues to endure because its greatest power has never come from evidence, but from the unanswered possibility imagined by those who hear it. The mystery that never really happened, yet refuses to die. Even after an impossible claim has been examined from every available angle, its ability to remain memorable can reveal a mystery that exists beyond the event itself. The Flight 914 legend has been compared against aviation records, investigated through historical questions, examined through scientific possibilities, and placed beside the realities of modern flight operations. At every stage, the same pattern appears. The evidence needed to confirm the story has never emerged, yet the story itself has continued to survive. That contradiction is what makes the legend unusual. Most claims disappear when they cannot withstand examination, but some remain because they become more than simple reports. They become symbols of curiosity, uncertainty, and the human desire to imagine possibilities beyond what is currently understood. The aircraft described in the legend may never have existed in the way the story claims, but the mystery surrounding it has taken on a life of its own, creating a different question that cannot be answered through flight records or technical investigations alone. Absent from official archives, verified records, and documented investigations, the Flight 914 story continues to occupy a unique place among modern aviation legends. The investigation into the claim reveals a striking absence of the evidence that would normally surround such an extraordinary event. A passenger aircraft disappearing and returning decades later would leave behind an enormous historical footprint. Records of the aircraft itself, information about the crew and passengers, reports from aviation authorities, and documentation from the airport and airline involved. Yet those expected traces have never been confirmed. Instead, what remains is a collection of repeated accounts that describe an impossible journey without the supporting foundation of a documented incident. This absence does not make the story less interesting to those fascinated by mysteries. In some ways, it has become one of the reasons the legend continues. The unanswered questions created by missing evidence have allowed imagination to occupy the space where historical proof would normally exist. Human fascination with the unexplained has repeatedly preserved accounts that challenge ordinary understanding, especially when those stories leave behind questions rather than answers. Throughout history, people have been drawn to events that appear to exist at the edge of possibility, from unexplained disappearances to strange encounters that seem to challenge accepted knowledge. The appeal of such stories often comes from the tension between what is known and what remains uncertain. A mystery with a clear explanation eventually becomes history, but a mystery without resolution can continue changing, as each generation discovers it. Flight 914 follows this pattern because it combines several elements that naturally capture attention: an aircraft, a disappearance, a strange return, and the suggestion that something impossible occurred beyond ordinary experience. The lack of confirmation does not erase the fascination because the story was never sustained only by evidence. It was sustained by the question it created. Among all forms of modern travel, aviation carries a unique sense of mystery because it places ordinary people inside machines moving through distant skies beyond everyday experience. Unlike many forms of transportation, airplanes operate in an environment where most of the journey takes place beyond direct human observation. Passengers board at one location and arrive somewhere else, trusting complex systems that remain largely invisible to them. This distance between experience and understanding creates a natural space for imagination. The same technology that represents human achievement can also become a setting for mystery, because the skies remain vast, unfamiliar, and difficult for most people to personally explore. Stories involving aircraft disappearing, appearing unexpectedly, or encountering unusual circumstances often gain attention because they combine something familiar with something unknown. A plane is a symbol of precision and engineering, yet it also travels through an environment where uncertainty has always been part of the human imagination. Somewhere between documented history and shared folklore lies a space where repeated stories can become familiar enough to feel almost real. The transformation of Flight 914 from an unsupported claim into a widely recognized mystery demonstrates how powerful repetition can be. When a story appears in multiple places, audiences may naturally assume that each appearance represents another confirmation. However, repeated versions of the same account do not necessarily create new evidence. They create a larger presence for the story itself. Over time, details may become connected to the legend so strongly that separating the original claim from later additions becomes difficult. This process is common in folklore, where stories evolve through retelling and gain new meanings as they move between different audiences. Flight 914 exists within this space, where the boundary between entertainment, speculation, and perceived history has become increasingly blurred. The endurance of the legend also reveals something about the relationship between technology and mystery. Modern aviation has developed systems capable of tracking aircraft, recording communications, and documenting operations with extraordinary detail. Yet technological progress has not removed humanity's interest in unexplained possibilities. Instead, it has sometimes created new forms of fascination by highlighting the rare moments when something appears to challenge expectations. The more connected and measurable the world becomes, the more unusual stories involving missing information can stand out. Flight 94E remains captivating partly because it represents a contradiction. A story about an impossible event surviving in an age where evidence is expected to exist. The legend continues not because it escaped every investigation, but because it exists as an example of how powerful a mystery can become when imagination fills the spaces left by uncertainty. Among the countless mysteries that have captured public imagination, Flight 914 remains unusual because its greatest evidence is not a record of what happened, but the persistence of the question itself. The story has lasted because it invites people to consider a possibility that feels impossible, yet strangely compelling. What if an aircraft could somehow escape the normal passage of time? What if technology, despite all its advances, encountered something it could not explain? These questions are not supported by verified aviation history, but they reveal why the legend has remained memorable. The fascination comes from the idea rather than the event. Flight 914 represents the timeless human attraction toward the unknown, where curiosity continues even after investigation has reached its conclusion. After decades of speculation and investigation, the legend continues because it represents something larger than a missing aircraft or an impossible timeline. It reflects humanity's ongoing fascination with boundaries, between science and imagination, between fact and folklore, and between what can be proven and what can only be wondered about. The investigation has shown that the famous account of Flight 914 does not match the records expected of a real aviation event, yet the story itself has become a part of modern mystery culture. Its survival demonstrates that some legends do not endure because they contain hidden truths waiting to be discovered. They endure because they reveal something about the people who continue telling them. Every generation that encounters the story brings new questions, new interpretations, and new curiosity about whether there are still mysteries beyond human understanding. The enduring mystery of Flight 914 remains not in the possibility that a plane crossed through time, but in how a story with no confirmed journey continues to travel through the imagination of the world.